I'm Nick Payton-Walsh in Beirut, and this is CNN.
Hello and good morning. It's Thursday, October the 10th. I'm Santos at CNN London.
And good afternoon. I'm Pauline Chu at CNN Hong Kong. Welcome to World Business Today.
These are the top stories this hour. Signs of a deal to prevent a default in Washington as the government shutdown enters day 10.
Investors looking for stimulus clues find the Federal Reserve split right down the middle.
And the U.S. suspends some military aid to Egypt, but Cairo does have other friends with deep pockets.
We'll get to business news in just a moment, but first, this is our top news story. A Libyan militia group says it's detaining the country's prime minister. It says Ali Zaidan is in custody because he's accused of corruption. Armed men took the prime minister from a hotel in the capital of Tripoli to an unknown location a little bit earlier today. Mr. Zaidan's office is calling this incident a kidnapping. Our senior international correspondent, Nick Robertson, is live in Tripoli with more on this story. Nick, this took place at the hotel where the prime minister actually lives. How did it happen and who's behind this?
Well, it's the operations room of the Libyan revolutionaries who say that they're behind this. This is a government-sanctioned militia. According to eyewitnesses, they turned up at the hotel, about 100 or 150 of them in 30 to 40 vehicles, heavily armed, took the prime minister at gunpoint. No shots were fired, but this organization is saying that it's now holding the prime minister, that he is accused of crimes against the interests of the country. They are portraying this as sort of the regular crimes, if you will, with a sort of an arrest warrant process. But the Justice Ministry is being very clear on this. They are saying absolutely no way was an arrest warrant issued for the Prime Minister, and they are calling this a kidnapping at this time. The group that's behind the taking the Prime Minister has said this is not connected with the abduction of Abu Anas al-Libi, as the government has called it, an abduction, an arrest by U.S. Forces over the weekend here in Tripoli. They're saying this is not connected with that. However, just a few days ago, this same organization was saying that it would track down any people here that were accomplices of foreign intelligence services in the capture of al-Libi, and that these people would be punished. So I think we cannot take everything at face value in this developing situation, but what is absolutely clear is the Prime Minister has been taken at gunpoint by a militia, and he is being held by that militia. We do know that the Council of Ministers is due to meet at the moment, whereby the government may decide its next steps. That's not clear. Very much a developing situation, Pauline.
Yeah, we know you're gathering more details, but what we do know is that more than 100 gunmen walked into this hotel and escorted the prime minister out. All right, Nick, we know you're going to have your eye on this story. Thank you very much. Nick Robertson there, live from Tripoli. Nina.
Well, in other news, Pauline, a deal could be coming together eventually in Washington to avert a U.S. government debt default next week. Republican lawmakers tell CNN that party leaders could put forward a proposal to temporarily raise the legal debt ceiling. Well, if it's not raised, in the next 7 days, the federal government will probably run out of money to pay its bills. President Barack Obama will be meeting with senior Republicans at the White House later on Thursday. That in itself, some say, is a sign of progress. There's been little talking and no real negotiation in the previous 9 days of this government shutdown, and Republican sources say that even if we do get a deal to raise the debt ceiling in the U.S., well, it won't end the shutdown, at least for now. So coming up in the next few hours, this man, the Treasury Secretary, Jack Lew, will be giving his testimony to Congress. He's due to speak before the markets open on Wall Street. He's been consistently warning the longer the stalemate goes on, the more the world's largest economy will continue to suffer. Well, if there's one thing that US lawmakers can agree on at the moment, is that they don't really agree on anything. Namely, they can't even agree who should actually be at that meeting at the White House today. As Jim Acosta now reports.
With the Obama administration warning of an economic catastrophe if the U.S. crashes through the debt ceiling, the president is inviting every member of Congress to the White House this week. The first group on the invite list, House Democrats.
This is about the president meeting with as many members of Congress as he can to talk about these very important issues and the need to make sure that we don't inflict severe damage on our economy and on our middle class unnecessarily.
But both sides can't even agree on who will attend the meetings. House Speaker John Boehner notified the White House Republicans will send their leadership and key committee chairmen, but not every member. A Boehner spokesman said in a statement, a meeting is only worthwhile if it is focused on finding a solution. White House Press Secretary Jay Carney fired back, saying the president is disappointed and he will talk to anyone, anytime, and looks forward to their visit to the White House, but will not pay the Republicans ransom for doing their job. That kind of bickering explains why the favorability of the GOP has plunged to just 28% in a Gallup poll. Not much better for Democrats at 43%. The growing public outrage explains why both parties were moving frantically to restore death benefits to military families, with the White House announcing it was handling it administratively, as the House prepared to approve its own fix.
Correct.
Should be resolved, and
that's what the president expects. He was not pleased to learn of this problem, and he has directed the OMB and his lawyers to find a solution, and he expects to have one today.
But the Defense Department warned of this painful side effect of the shutdown days ago.
We would also be required to do some other bad things to our people. Just some examples: we couldn't immediately pay death gratuities to those who die on active duty during the lapse.
One optic the president could control: his selection of Janet Yellen as the next chair of the Federal Reserve, a move expected to calm global financial markets, at least for now.
We've made progress, and we shouldn't do anything to threaten that progress. For these hard-won gains have made a difference to millions of Americans.
As for Janet Yellen, she's widely expected to be confirmed by the Senate. And as for those military death benefits, a White House official tells CNN that the Defense Department's arrangement with a private charity to provide those payments should resolve the issue. Jim Acosta, CNN, the White House.
So, as you just heard there from Jim Acosta, Janet Yellen has been nominated to chair the Fed, first woman ever to do so. And the markets are greeting that as a positive sign because, of course, she's rather pro-stimulus. We did have the minutes coming from the last Fed rate meeting, which showed that Fed members, and that includes Yellen, because she's the number 2 at the Fed at the moment before this promotion, were actually split when it comes to whether or not to continue quantitative easing. And that'll be something to watch as the Fed heads into its next FOMC. For the moment, the markets, as you can see, doing rather well. This is a complete change from the picture that we've seen over the last 3 or 4 trading days when they've languished in the red. The European Central Bank, so talking about another central bank this time, it has just released its monthly report on the state of the economy over here. We'll see how that affects the markets as investors manage to digest what the ECB has been saying. I might add that what the ECB will be saying will be coming hot on the heels of the IMF deciding to raise its forecast for the Eurozone for 2014, but they're still expecting a recession or at least a contraction for this region in that year. The Bank of England makes an announcement on interest rates today as well, so that'll be something to watch out for on that market. The FTSE 100 will have more on all these events later on the programme, but just looking at the markets, it seems as though the CAC 40 really is the beneficiary of what's happening in today's session, Pauline.
Well, you're having a better start to the day than the way we ended the session here in Asia, Nina. It was mainly a down day in the Asia-Pacific region. While the numbers in Mumbai are still moving, they are tracking downward at the moment, although still barely in positive territory. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the Nikkei bucked the trend, generally gaining more than 1% as the yen weakened against the dollar. Mining stocks dragged down the Aussie market there, dragged it lower as commodity prices slipped overnight. But of course, the main theme is the U.S. and the stalemate that we're seeing on Capitol Hill. Investors are paying close attention to the debt ceiling deadline, and until that's sorted, we could be in for more of the same, as the deadline is just 7 days away. Now, Samsung was one of the stocks that we were watching closely today as it unveiled the world's first smartphone with a curved screen right here. But there wasn't much reaction on the Kospi, as you can see there, because shares closed basically flat in Seoul. Now, here's a little bit more about the phone. You can't roll the phone up, even though it's curved. It's not flexible. But Samsung says the display on its Galaxy Round phone is more comfortable and more convenient for users. It did go on sale in Korea today for about $1,000, but Samsung did not say when it might be available in other countries. Nina.
$1,000. Ouch, that's an awful lot to pay for a phone, isn't it? You'd better want to have insurance for that. Well, talking about stock markets, let's have a look at how they fared in the United States yesterday. They did manage to stabilise after the president's nomination of Janet Yellen as the next Fed chair. After 2 days' worth of selling, the Dow and the S&P 500 both managed to eke out some pretty modest gains at the end of the day, but stocks like Facebook, Tesla and Netflix all lost ground, and that managed to drag the Nasdaq down. So, as you can see, that was the picture on the trading day yesterday. Well, US earnings season is also up and running, and A is still for Acosta, despite the fact that the aluminium giant was booted out of the Dow last month. Its third quarter profit did beat analyst estimates. It made $24 million. That's compared with a loss of $143 million this time last year, and it includes nearly $96 million worth of write-downs and one-off costs. Revenue for this company was on par with last year's figures. Pretty good, that is, bearing in mind that aluminium prices have fallen back significantly. The numbers came out after Wall Street's close, so we'll see how investors respond to them later. But as you can see, there's also already been plenty of optimism on Wednesday's session, with shares gaining more than 2% for that particular stock. They gained another 0.5% after hours. The reason why we focus so heavily on Alcoa is because it's a big bellwether and it sets the tone for the earnings seasons to come. It's the first company that reports there on Wall Street. Well, still to come on WBT. In Washington, it's not just lawmakers who can't agree. Fed members, as I was telling you before, also split. They're arguing over when to taper back on stimulus. We'll take a look at what that means for the markets and the US economy after the break.
Hyundai believes this is where your inspirations set you free. Hyundai makes every drive brilliant. Live brilliant. Hyundai.
Winning Post, in association with Longines.
The spotlight is intense for any trainer with a runner in one of the world's top races. But if you've got a Japanese horse in the Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe, be prepared for the entourage and the expectation that comes with it.
This is the biggest horse racing in the world. So even the normal Japanese racing fans knows this race is so special.
The Japanese are already a major force in the industry, having won some of the world's richest races, including the Dubai World Cup and the Melbourne Cup. But it's the Arc that they feel would confirm their position amongst the top racing nations.
Yay! Winning Post, in association with Longines.
My voice, my story,
my life. In South Africa.
In Kenya.
South Sudan.
Hear Africa's voices.
A way of understanding the world.
A dog to the soul.
In Africa.
In Africa.
In Africa.
CNN African Voices.
This week, meet Kenyan human rights activist Aggrey Otieno and hear how he's empowering the poor in Nairobi. African Voices, Sunday on CNN in association with Glow.
As vice chair for the past 3 years, she's been exemplary and a driving force of policies to help boost our economic recovery. You know, Janet is renowned for her good judgment. She sounded the alarm early about the housing bubble, about excesses in the financial sector, and about the risks of a major recession. She doesn't have a crystal ball, but what she does have is a keen understanding about how markets and the economy work.
That's Mr. Obama there with a glowing reference for Janet Yellen, his nominee to succeed Ben Bernanke as the head of the U.S. Federal Reserve. Now, if she gets the top job and is confirmed by the Senate, Yellen will have her work cut out for her. She will be heading a Fed split right down the middle on the topic of stimulus and when to taper. Now, minutes from the Fed's September meeting show the decision not to taper was actually a close call, even though the vote was 9-1. The members said there was no guarantee that the job market would continue to improve, and they were worried about a government shutdown and a debt ceiling battle, which is exactly what we've got on our hands today. And now there's talk that the much-discussed taper may not actually happen until next year. ING economist Valentijn van Nieuwenhuizen joins us now live from The Hague to give us his thoughts on where the Fed might go from here. Valentijn, thank you very much for being with us. Now, with the U.S. Congress in this deadlock over the debt ceiling, it really does reframe the whole discussion about tapering. What do you think the Fed will be looking at when it meets next?
Well, you're absolutely right. It is very difficult to say something concrete about that for as long as we do not have a final decision on the debt ceiling. However, I agree with the consensus, although not ignoring the risks surrounding that debt ceiling, that there will be a solution found in the second half of October. And that means that by the time we are running into the next Fed meeting, that risk factor should be largely out of the way, although only a temporary postponement of a debt ceiling increase could be a remaining risk factor. So unless we get just a couple of weeks or months over the debt ceiling postponement issue, I think the Fed could be looking at tapering later this year already, if indeed the fiscal situation is clear and we will be refocusing to the underlying strengths in the US economy.
Now, Valentijn, one of the issues that we saw from these minutes that was splitting the FOMC was whether or not it should follow through with guidance that the Fed issued back in June when it said that tapering might happen as soon as this year. Some of the FOMC members were concerned that if they didn't start to taper, they would lose credibility. And as we saw, investors were very surprised by their decision. Now, if Janet Yellen is in fact confirmed as the next Fed chief, do you think she might rethink this kind of policy of telegraphing or this kind of forward guidance?
Well, she obviously will continue to think about it, but I would really be surprised if she would rethink the whole approach. Remember, she has been in the driving seat in designing the new communication strategy of the Fed, and she has endorsed the approach taken so far. Now, clearly, they are walking a new path, and therefore refinement along the way will probably need to come. And the recent experience surrounding tapering and the decision not to taper in September clearly was a bit of a miscommunication and thereby, to some extent, a failure of the Fed's communication approach. But I think we're talking about enhancements rather than really changing course for the Fed communication style, as long as Yellen is indeed to be appointed as a new chair.
Valentijn, thank you very much for your perspective today and for joining us there from The Hague. That's ING economist Valentijn van Nieuwenhuizen. Nina.
Interesting stuff, Pauline. Well, up next, the Obama administration speaks to Egypt with its checkbook. In a moment's time, we'll tell you more about the funds that won't take flight for the Egyptian military, and also where Egypt is looking for other friends with deep pockets.
This is Malawi, the warm heart of Africa. Adventure with your heart and soul in the warm heart of Africa. Destination Malawi.
My voice, my story,
my life. In South Africa.
In Kenya.
South Sudan.
Hear Africa's voices.
A way of understanding the world.
A door to the soul.
In Africa.
In Africa.
In Africa.
CNN African Voices.
This week, meet Kenyan human rights activist Aggrey Otieno and hear how he's empowering the poor in Nairobi. African Voices, Sunday on CNN in association with Glow.
It's
been one of the most talked about sailing events ever, and it's happening right here on San Francisco Bay.
This month on Mainsail, we witnessed what is arguably the greatest America's Cup final in its history. The racing spectacular, the story compelling, as New Zealand takes on the might of the USA for the oldest trophy in world sport.
Mainsail, today only on CNN, in association with Rolex.
Hi, this is Celine Dion asking you to help put an end to premature birth. I share the concerns and fears of every parent, knowing that more than 1 million babies around the world die every year simply because they didn't get enough time to grow. Let's work together for stronger, healthier babies. Visit facebook.com/World Prematurity Day to find out how you can make a difference. Thank you for caring.
This month on CNN Go, plunge into Dubai. From palm-shaped islands to the world's tallest building.
It's just absolutely amazing.
We travel through desert landscapes and dine at one of the world's finest restaurants. Explore the glitz and glamour of Dubai in a luxury edition of CNN Go. Saturday on CNN. In association with Korean Air.
Welcome back to World Business Today. The Obama administration says it's suspending significant military aid to Egypt. This is a response to the bloody crackdown on supporters of former President Mohamed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. It means hundreds of millions of dollars in assistance will be drying up. Egypt and its military, however, won't exactly be penniless after this cut in U.S. aid. That's because several Gulf nations are already providing plenty of financial help. Emerging Markets editor John Defterius joins us now live from CNN Abu Dhabi. John, how much of an impact will the U.S. decision actually have on Egypt and its plans?
Well, Pauline, it's loaded with symbolism, but the cash value is not that severe, as a matter of fact. The cash injection, the latest one being held back, is $260 million. And there's been plenty of money coming, particularly from right here in the region. This gives you a sense of what's been going on. We have some video from Monday with Adli Mansour, who's the interim president, of course, of Egypt, going to Jeddah, being greeted at the airport by the Crown Prince. He held meetings this week, in fact, with the King of Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah, to reiterate once again that Saudi Arabia and others from the Gulf states are willing to give money. Now, how much money are we talking about here? Let's go back to July, when we had a trio of countries from here in the Gulf states offer funding to Egypt after the ouster of President Mohamed Morsi. It was $5 billion from Saudi Arabia, $4 billion from Kuwait, and $3 billion from right here in the UAE. And they're suggesting that if more funding is needed after the comments from Saudi Arabia in the last 24 hours, they would be there to support this interim government to try to get to elections, get the Constitution done by the end of the year, and hopefully get elections by the start of next year. Now, there's another thing here. There's no love lost between, of course, the Gulf states and the Muslim Brotherhood. They, in fact, felt that they lost this arc of influence because of the placement of the Muslim Brotherhood in the elections last year. And now that he's been ousted, they want to see if that arc from Saudi Arabia all the way down to Egypt can come back into play here. Qatar was playing a very strong role in Egypt, in Syria, Libya, and Tunisia, and took away some of that influence from Saudi Arabia. They're suggesting right now with this funding right here, they want to see Egypt stabilize, especially with its population of 85 million. And they're there to provide the funding, even though the United States and others right now may be holding back, Pauline.
Yeah, $12 billion is some nice padding there for Egypt. In the meantime, it has been in talks with the IMF for a couple of years now for almost $5 billion in aid. That was really held up in limbo recently. But now that the Gulf states have stepped in with all of this money, have those talks with the IMF lost even more momentum?
Yeah, indeed. You can see that Egypt's taking a stronger tone to its discussions with the International Monetary Fund. And as a matter of fact, for the IMF World Bank meetings this weekend, they shrunk down the delegation substantially. The Deputy Prime Minister was supposed to be attending, as well as the Central Bank Governor. They decided not to go because there's such a wide gulf between Egypt and the IMF. And this prompted a response from the Managing Director, Christine Lagarde, overnight, as quoted in an Egyptian newspaper. She is suggesting, I'm ready to send a team to Cairo as soon as the authorities wish to advance our common understanding of the current economic situation. Now, this is political speak a little bit here, Pauline. What they're suggesting is there's a wide gulf between the two of them. The IMF saying if you want to get back on track with your growth, you got to reduce the subsidies for fuel and food going forward. Egypt saying that is very politically difficult in the climate right now. And if push comes to shove, they'll rely on the Gulf funding. So they were down to some $14 billion in reserves at the end of June. That has climbed up to nearly $18 billion with the cash injections that we see from the Gulf states. Mrs. Lagarde saying, let's go back to the table and see if we can sit and see eye to eye. But right now, Egypt's taking the position if the IMF is not going to change on the subsidies and that strategy to reduce them, they'll rely on their neighbors until the political situation calms down, see if they can get the Constitution done by the end of the year and go to elections in 2014. What is deadly clear right now is that the Gulf states right now, Pauline, do not want to take any chances and see this interim government knocked out of power in Egypt. They want to see the transition completed, and that's why they're providing the $12 billion between now and, say, February, because that's how long it will last. Pauline?
Yes, so many moving parts to this story. John, thank you once again for great context. Our emerging markets editor, John Defterios, there, live from Abu Dhabi. Nina.
Well, Pauline, the Bank of England is wrapping up its two-day rate-setting meeting, and it's also talked about stimulus measures, surprise, surprise. Coming up, we'll take a look at what analysts and economists expect to hear from Mark Carney and company in the hours to come. Do stay with us.
The 60th Macau Grand Prix, coming soon.
Barack Obama will be re-elected President of the United States.
Dawn in Aleppo brings the clatter of gunfire. There seems to be no pattern to the attacks unless they are designed to sow fear among the civilians.
This is the reality of what kids think about race.
This is Emmy-winning journalism. This is CNN.
The Taliban tried to kill her for going to school. They only made her stronger. Her name is Malala, and she talks to CNN's Christiane Amanpour. Her story, her future, her dreams. The bravest girl in the world. Monday on CNN. Tonight on CNN. Connect the world with Becky Anderson. Followed by Quest Means Business. Then Amanpour. It's your new evening lineup. Tonight on CNN.
I'm Ben Wiedemann in Rome, and this is CNN.
Live from CNN Hong Kong, I'm Pauline Chu.
And I'm Nina Dos Santos at CNN London. A warm welcome back. You're watching World Business Today. We're just over an hour into Thursday's trading session here in Europe, and the market's really getting on to a rather nice start, especially given the red arrows that we've seen dominating the agenda this week. Investors have plenty to think about with the US government shutdown, perhaps showing some signs of abating, or at least averting the debt ceiling issues over there. Investors also digesting the European Central Bank's latest report on the state of the economy in this region. The general message coming from that is that global growth will remain subdued overall, and that growth in advanced economies is looking slightly more encouraging than in other parts of the world. Speaking of the ECB, I want to point out there's something really interesting that has come out in the last hour or so. The ECB has decided to enter a bilateral currency swap with the People's Bank of China. And this swap line would have a maximum value of around about 350 billion Chinese yuan. That's around about 45 billion euros. The reason why I mention this, Pauline, as you as I well know, the Chinese hold over $1.5 trillion worth of US treasuries, and they're getting awfully worried about the prospect of a default. So that in itself is interesting, that they could diversify into euros.
Yeah, very interesting. And China is not only the largest foreign holder of U.S. debt, Japan is the second largest. And we saw some movements in the bond market in Japan today. I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. But as in Europe, the U.S. debt ceiling is giving investors in Asia plenty to think about. But we had a different reaction here from what you're seeing in Europe. Most of the major indices ended in negative territory. But take a look at Tokyo. The Nikkei ended up by more than 1% as the yen weakened against the dollar. And data today from the Japanese Ministry of Finance shows that Japanese investors sold a record amount of foreign bonds last week. Now, this data was just released today. We took a look at it, and it showed that they dumped $23 billion worth of overseas bonds, most likely U.S. Treasuries, although we won't know for sure until we get the monthly data out. But you can surmise that most of that was U.S. Treasury bills. Now, this is happening as the deadlock in Washington continues, and it means that the U.S. is creeping towards a potential debt default on October 17th. Japan, as I mentioned, is the second largest foreign holder of U.S. debt. So Japan, China, Brazil, many oil exporters, all very keen to see what happens because they hold so much U.S. debt, Nina.
Yeah, well, speaking of central banks as well, because with Janet Yellen's appointment at the Fed, they're very much in focus too. The Bank of England will be making an announcement on interest rates later on this very Thursday. Policymakers are widely expected by many economists out there to keep rates at their current record low level of just 0.5%. Analysts also say that it's unlikely that the central bank will change the amount of money that it's currently pumping into the economy in the form of that famed term quantitative easing. The BOE, led by the recent newcomer, the governor, Mark Carney, says that rates will only go up when unemployment falls to a level of around about 7%. It expects to hit that target in mid to late 2016, but most economists think that the goal could be met by the end of next year. Carney says that he doesn't see the need for more stimulus in the form of bond buying because the UK economy overall is improving these days. Well, earlier this week, the International Monetary Fund did raise its outlook for economic growth in Britain for 2013 and 2040, despite lowering its overall global economic forecast. So that is very much a change of tack from the IMF, which had berated the Finance Minister of the UK, George Osborne, for his harsh stance on austerity before. For more on the UK's economic outlook, I'm joined in a London studio by Alan Clark, Director of Global Banking and Markets at Scotiabank. Great to have you on the show. Alan, the UK, what state is it in?
It's doing well. Economic growth did very well in the second quarter of the year. In about 3 weeks' time, we'll know how we did in the third quarter. We could grow by as much as 1%, maybe more. So surveys are doing really well. The economy's doing OK, but inflation's still a bit of a pain.
And that could get worse with this new Help to Buy scheme. The government has been offering rafts of mortgages, allowing people to get on the housing ladder for the first time with only 5% deposits. But that really could be the thorn in its side. A lot of people saying there's a bubble brewing.
But it's good and bad. Were it not for the first phase of Help to Buy, I think the consumer would have been pretty downbeat this year because, in real terms, people got less spare cash in their pockets because inflation's rising fast in their wages, and normally that would mean they'd spend less. But never underestimate the ability of the housing market to make people happy and make them go out and spend more than they earn. And so we're having a solid year. But you're right, this is what caused the crisis, a housing boom. I'm not too worried. I think it will cool off in due course into next year, but you're right, it's an amber flashing warning light.
And it's something that the IMF themselves have mentioned. The IMF has changed its tone decidedly over the last year and a half on the UK government strategy, though.
Well, I think we're all suffering from whiplash because it's been such an abrupt turnaround in the UK outlook, partly because of the housing market, but also austerity is not really having the drag on growth that we feared that it would.
And we've also got a new man at the helm, recently arrived from Canada of the Bank of England. He's taken all sorts of tactics on board that the Fed is using, targeting unemployment, etc., etc. But really, it seems as though if the economy is going to improve better, the next thing he's going to have to do is reassure people that rates aren't going anywhere anytime soon.
Well, conveniently for him, the Bank of England's job is to keep inflation at around 2%. Now, when it last projected its forecasts, it said in about 2 years' time we'll be a bit above 2%. But since then, we've had a massive appreciation in the exchange rate, and that really pushes down on inflation. We've seen it through petrol prices diving. And so when it updates its forecast in about a month's time, I think it's going to be forecasting very low inflation, which will allow it much more flexibility to leave interest rates on hold for some time to come.
Now, when the Fed decides to do something, everybody else seems to follow, either for reasons of policy or just for the general trend, etc. What do you think the new Fed chair is going to do in terms of having an effect on Mark Carney's thinking going forward at the Bank of England, especially with regards to quantitative easing?
Well, to be fair to Mark Carney, the Bank of Canada did forward guidance first, so the Fed's taken Canadian lessons, and now the British are taking Canadian lessons. So I don't think they'll pay too much attention to what the UK is doing, because we're our own special case. We're linked up with the Eurozone. It's all about Fed taper in the US, and from their minutes last night, it looks like they may not do that right until the start of 2014. So they're in a different league. They're loosening policy. We're thinking about tightening.
Can we really afford to tighten policy here?
No, not until wage inflation picks up, because, as I say, people's spare cash is going down, not up. And until wages start to pick up, and there's some hope now that the labour market's recovering that will happen in a year or so's time, but interest rate hikes really shouldn't happen for well over a year. Back end of 2015 is my view.
Just generally, what's your overall outlook for the global economy, especially when the Fed does eventually start tapering? Because we've got this sort of very uncertain situation in America, potential for a default, which seems ludicrous to anybody who's outside the United States. And then the Fed could be losing its credibility if it doesn't eventually taper when it promised to do so.
Well, we've got the same symptoms in the US as we've got in Europe. Austerity, the foot's going to be on the brake pedal for many years to come. That's a drag. And ultimately, when they stop tapering, there's less stimulus. When people start to raise interest rates, there's less stimulus. So it's not really going to be a rapid pace of growth anytime soon.
Alan Clark from Scotiabank, thank you so much for coming in our London studio here on World Business Today. Very interesting views there, I might say, on where the UK is heading and where the rest of the world is heading to. Well, let's get back to the US, where the government shutdown and that debt ceiling debate has been rocking the markets for plenty of time now. Without an agreement in the next few days, let's remind you that things could get an awful lot worse. However, as Zain Asher now reports, not all traders are overly concerned.
They're getting fearful, and they're thinking, you know, that it is the end of the world, that this is Armageddon.
Jeffrey Seeker manages $1 billion on behalf of wealthy investors. He's been watching the gridlock in Washington closely, concerned about how to keep his clients calm as they continue to pull money out of the stock market.
I think my clients have grown very used to dysfunction, but the dysfunction has usually been followed up with some quick fix solution.
And with no solution in sight, the red arrows on his trading terminal are now becoming regular fixtures.
If we get within a few days of that deadline, we're going to see a lot of havoc in the markets. That's without question.
With so much client money at stake, he's hoping Congress pulls us back from the ledge sooner rather than later.
How do you, as a trader, read between the lines of what politicians say?
If you listen to everything they're saying, you're going to be ultimately incredibly confused, because there is so many cross currents, so many different messages from one press conference to the next.
Which is why some traders are blocking out the politics completely.
To me, it's just a bunch of guys talking. Some guy was reading Dr. Seuss the other day, so am I really supposed to take these people seriously?
Hedge fund manager J.C. Peretz knows very little about the drama in Washington or about the significance of October 17th, the day the United States could lose its ability to borrow money, potentially leading to a default on its debt.
To me, that's all it is. It's just noise. So one guy says one thing, another guy says another thing.
And blocking out the noise has served him well. He says his portfolio is up about 3% since the government shut down. He says everyone else should cover their ears too.
Don't worry about it. The less you know, the better. Just keep doing what you're doing.
Meanwhile, Seeker is paying close attention. He knows there's a potential storm coming and is ready to heed the warnings and pull out of stocks as soon as there's a hint that Congress won't raise the debt ceiling in time.
It's going to be absolutely catastrophic if it happens. Sometimes you do have to do things in order to not put yourself in a position, because hope is a very bad investment strategy.
Zain Asher, CNN, New York.
And it's hard to shut out all the noise when you can see what the repercussions are. And as far as the debt ceiling goes, those repercussions of a U.S. default would be felt far beyond its borders and could hit emerging economies especially hard. World Bank President Dr. Jim Yong Kim explained how to our Richard Quest.
We're very concerned because right now there are so many headwinds as it is for emerging markets in the developing world that kind of impact really could be devastating.
When you say that, is this the budget or is it the debt ceiling? Which for you is the more worrying?
It's the debt ceiling. It's the potential for default that really is of greatest concern. You know, the last time it happened was just in August of 2011, and the impacts were severe. I mean, there are many ways that it has the impact, but interest rates go up, right? There is a flight to safety, and then the currencies in developing countries could go down. And, you know, just overall confidence goes down. And right now, many countries need to continue to invest. And if there's a strong confidence effect, we're going to have trouble. And the headwinds that these economies are already facing are just going to get stiffer.
The problem, of course, is we know to some extent that they are playing. I mean, Warren Buffett described it as they're playing with nuclear weapons. But they continue to do so. You're in Washington. It's happening up the road from you.
What I want to say is that for the legislators, I want them to know that the closer they get to default, the bigger the impact it's going to have, not on giant corporations. I mean, that everyone knows that the big companies will all be affected. But it's the rice farmers in Southeast Asia. It's the young men and women in the Middle East who are trying to start businesses. All of those people will be affected and will be affected severely. And those are the people, of course, who we're most concerned about.
Well, just remind us again how they are affected.
When interest rates go up on U.S. Treasuries, which we've already seen, borrowing costs go up all over the place. And of course, if capital is more scarce and if you just can't get access to capital, it's a problem in all developing countries. But the line directly, of course, is that as everything slows down, as markets drop, as economic activity slows down, we often forget that it does have a direct impact on the poorest.
Are you making, as yet, contingency plans for what could happen?
Yeah, you know, we've been very good at responding to various disasters. From when the economic crisis hit, we increased our lending a lot, and we're ready to move just as we have before to support the poorest countries. Many of them will just need direct budget support in order to just keep their governments running, to provide basic services. We've done it before, and we're ready to do it again.
That's a great conversation there between the World Bank president and our Richard Quest. And tonight, on another special edition of Quest Means Business live from Washington, we'll have highlights from an IMF panel discussion that Richard will moderate. He'll get perspective on a number of key issues, including the U.S. debt ceiling crisis, the global economy as a whole, emerging markets, and the effects of austerity and tapering, as well as China's economic strength. So a full plate right there. And he will have a top-notch panel with the IMF's Christine Lagarde, India's new central bank governor, Spain's finance minister, the deputy governor of the People's Bank of China, and also President Obama's chair of economic advisors. That is at 9 o'clock in the evening, London time, on Quest Means Business. So don't miss that. Well, just ahead on World Business Today, after this break, we will spotlight one of the richest men in Indonesia and hear his views on how to profit from opportunities in his country.
Living Golf Minute in time with Rolex.
Next month, Tiger Woods will be hitting a ball off the Bosphorus Bridge. This year, he'll be playing in the Turkish Airlines Open, a tournament with the full weight of the Turkish government behind it.
Bu çok büyük bir organizasyon.
This is a very important event. Organising an event such as this one is no doubt going to contribute to the brand value of Turkey. In addition, to demonstrate the importance we attach to this event, this is going to be the event that will receive the highest amount of contribution from the Ministry of Culture and Tourism ever.
And so next month, a country with only 6,000 registered players will stage one of the richest events on the European tour. It's a symbol of where Turkey is as an economic power and where it wants to be as a golfing nation.
Why this watch? This watch is a witness to age defied, records broken, marathons won, and giant leaps taken. It's seen glimpses of heaven, miracle comebacks, and risk rewarded. It doesn't just tell time, it tells history.
Where can you find the largest collection of real estate opportunities in the Middle East? The 12th edition of Cityscape Global will be 50% bigger, featuring 200 plus exhibitors and 25,000 plus visitors. Meeting points for the global real estate industry, featuring the region's largest showcase of investment and leasing opportunities across residential, commercial, industrial, retail and hospitality real estate sector from 8th to 10th of October 2013 at the Dubai World Trade Center.
Welcome back to World Business Today. Running a business in a developing country comes with massive challenges, but can mean huge opportunities as well. Take Indonesia, for example. It's rich in natural resources and also has the 4th biggest population in the world. But on the other hand, there is corruption, weak infrastructure, and also limited education. Patricia Wu asked one of Indonesia's richest men, Hairul Tanjung, about his strategy for growth.
Was not one of Hairul Tanjung's childhood dreams.
I come from the poor family, so because of that, I have to come to the public university. I don't care about what this discipline is. So finally, I graduate as a dentist.
But that training actually helped him to build CT Corp, a media, retail, and banking empire that Forbes estimates makes him worth $3.4 billion.
If the teeth is a problem, you try to fix it. If cannot, you just pull out, right? So that is in the business also. If you have a problem in the company, we try to fix it. If not, just killing the company, or selling the company.
One of his most famous successes, turning around Carrefour here when its original foreign owners failed. His advice?
Knowing about Indonesia, I think is very important for the foreign investors. And the more fastest is actually try to partner with somebody from Indonesia. But we understand also, the good partner is not so easy.
Indonesia's economy is difficult to navigate, but especially now with slowing growth and rising inflation.
One of these is worth more than 11,000 rupiah. The currency has dropped around 16% so far this year versus the U.S. dollar, as the U.S. considers tightening its monetary policy and investor confidence in Indonesia starts to slip.
Tanjung points to the country's population of 250 million as an asset that he believes can be counted on and uses Carrefour as an example.
Even with this situation, we can grow around 20 to 30% every year. So that is not because the situation of reversing quantity easing, not because also the bonanza of China and India, but because the growing or consuming class in Indonesia.
Hundreds of millions were spent on upgrading infrastructure here in Bali to host the APEC summit. Tanjung served as vice chair of the local organizing committee. But elsewhere in the country, aging infrastructure and corruption have hindered growth. Tanjung believes the country is showing its commitment to anti-corruption.
Indonesia, not only the chairman of constitution judge, ministers, governors, mayors, plenty, more than 100 going to the jail. Never happen is ever to other country.
From his lofty perch, Tanjung sees potential for his country, saying the key to unlocking that potential is the same one that fueled his rise: education.
We need waiting another 10 to 20 years to make it the new generation to also very smart of Indonesia, and they are not poor, yeah, and they are the rich people.
Decades after graduating as a dentist, the 51-year-old's dreams are much bigger now. Patricia Wu, CNN, Bali, Indonesia.
Well, elsewhere in the region, 2 tropical cyclones are threatening the Philippines and eastern India. Our meteorologist Ivan Cabrera is at the CNN Weather Center with all the details. Morning, Ivan.
Good to see you. And in fact, we were talking about U.S. State Secretary Kerry canceling the trip to the Philippines because of this system here that, of course, will arrive as a typhoon with very strong winds. You can begin to appreciate, see this little speck here? That looks like an eye is trying to form. Just an indication of a strengthening storm here as it continues barreling towards the west. No question about where this is going. This has been a forecast that we have been saying due west here. That's been easy. The intensity remains to be seen. It could still intensify to as much as 160 kilometers per hour. But the good news about that is that it is hitting an area here where there's less people. So by the time it gets to the populated places, we're going to be talking about the wind a little buffeted here and the rain that's going to be significant, certainly, over the next few days. There it is in 36 hours. Again, this is going to be a nighttime event, so it's going to be making landfall Friday night locally into the wee morning hours of Saturday. There's the rain potential. That's just in the next couple of days. I think those numbers will be even higher than that. So we have Nari, we have this feature. We'll monitor that through Guam, but right now this is the other one. Look at this thing. This is now strengthening. We have not had the new advisory. I promise you that this is not 100 kph. This is at least 120, 130, and it'll continue heading off to the north and west over the next few days as a very strong storm here. Of course, we call them severe cyclones in this part of the world, but there it is, just approaching the coast as we head through the day on Saturday with torrential rain, significant wind, but also the storm surge on the northern side of it. Some very populated areas here, unlike the part of the Philippines where the other one's making landfall. This one is going right towards millions of people here. As far as the storm surge, 2 to 4 meters, certainly possible with winds of 100 kilometers per hour. Stay with us. CNN Newsroom begins next hour, and then I'll have the new advisories for both storms. I think we'll have some important new information to share with you.
Certainly one to watch. Thanks very much. Ivan Cabrera there at the CNN Weather Center. Good to see you too. William?
Well, we already have a storm brewing above Capitol Hill, and with so much talk about the U.S. debt ceiling, you may have forgotten how it actually all began. But never fear, Richard Quest, in his own special way, will show us how Washington got itself into this mess. That's coming up next, right here on World Business Today.
Some people only see what's on the surface. Add depth to your perspective through our uncompromising investigations and unbiased insights. Trends, the international magazine on Arab affairs.
CNN original series Anthony Bourdain Parts Unknown, Copenhagen.
Denmark is like the happiest place on earth.
Go on a culinary adventure through one of the best restaurants in the world. Pushing you to rethink what's edible.
It's like I've never tasted a green vegetable that good.
Where it comes from.
Let's grab a bunch of these for lunch, no?
And how it reflects the Danish landscape and culture.
Cheers.
Anthony Bourdain Parts Unknown, Copenhagen, only on CNN. Connect the world with Becky Anderson. Quest Means Business. Armand Paul. It's your new evening lineup tonight on CNN.
Well, the US has precisely a week before it hits the debt ceiling. Without an agreement, this country could run out of money. Now, we've been talking a lot about the consequences of a debt default, so right now it seems like a good time to try and revisit how Washington got to this point in the first place. Here's Richard Quest to explain all.
Round and round. Every few years, the US government goes into battle over the debt ceiling. The essential law needed so that the government can keep borrowing more money. Because day by day, step by step, the US has to keep borrowing to keep the government open. Sometimes the US government goes through $60 billion in a day. The money goes far and wide, paying for government workers, infrastructure, even interest on existing debt. All this costs Washington money. As the spending continues, eventually the government will reach the legal limit of its authority to borrow. It has reached the debt ceiling, and unless the ceiling is raised, the options range from nasty to disastrous. At the moment, the US Treasury has its head just under the ceiling, but decisions have to be taken. There can be instant austerity, hold spending at existing levels. That, of course, would push the US and possibly the world economy towards recession. Then there's robbing Peter to pay Paul, deciding who gets paid, prioritizing. Technically, very difficult. And finally, there's always default. A catastrophe of dizzying proportions, sending confidence in the US economy tumbling down. Because there's so much US debt in the global economy, any form of default would have disastrous consequences for the markets. The only thing that's certain is it would take years to clear up the mess and chaos.
He might be there for some time, judging by the number of $1 bills there are on the floor there. Richard Quest, in his very own unique and entertaining style, explaining the US debt default, which could happen potentially if the US doesn't manage to raise its debt ceiling. So all this very much a theme in the markets over the last 9 or 10 days. As we've continued in the government shutdown mode in the United States, this is how the markets are doing here in Europe. Just a final check of them before we say goodbye to you for this early edition of World Business Today. Last time we looked at the markets, they were indeed rising. And yeah, they're holding on to those kind of gains, especially the CAC 40, which is rather robust this morning. We've had an interesting statement coming out of the ECB saying that they've entered a bilateral currency swap with the People's Bank of China. Pauline, as I mentioned before in the show, well, that's interesting considering as the Chinese, as the largest holders of US Treasury bills, are getting awfully worried about what's going on in Washington.
Yeah, and also it's a plus for China because they are trying to liberalize the yuan going to other countries and doing these direct trades. But as you say, Nina, it underscores the idea of going around the US dollar because many, many countries are very concerned about the debt of the Treasury bills that they hold and the amount of US Treasuries that they hold, namely China and Japan. Before we go, let's take another look at the Asia-Pacific markets and to see how they finished. It was a very different picture here in this region compared to what you're seeing in Europe. Most of the major indices down in negative territory, largely because of the concerns going on in Washington. But the Nikkei did buck the trend. It ended up more than 1% today as the yen weakened against the US dollar there, Nina.
Well, that's it for this early edition of World Business Today. Thanks for joining us. I'm Nina Dos Santos in London.
And I'm Pauline Chu in Hong Kong. World Business Today will be back in 4 hours from now with the opening bell on Wall Street. We hope to see you then. In the meantime, CNN Newsroom is coming up next.
In the business of bringing joy, Kirloskar goes much beyond enriching lives.
The Taliban tried to kill her for going to school. They only made her stronger. Her name is Malala, and she talks to CNN's Christiane Amanpour. Her story, her future, her dreams. The bravest girl in the world. Monday on CNN.
CNN News Center. Tonight on CNN.
You've been wanting to get this kind of access. Unfiltered, face-to-face exposure to Africa's key players who have a hand on what's next and know what works. Stop waiting for that door to open.
This is your opportunity for FaceTime.
They are the biggest names shaping Africa's business, and you want to know what they know.
And I think that's why Africa is attractive.
FaceTime Africa, every Friday on CNN, in association with MTN.
Every country has an identity, a history, customs, culture. A unique landscape that determines how its people live, work, and play. Now get an insider's look at some of the world's most incredible places with CNN's On the Road. This week, from homegrown